Hey, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Brianna Roberts. I am a first year Master's in Public Health student from Hampton, Virginia. And the School of Public Health Graduate Council really wanted to create a series on police power and presence on public health. And we have the pleasure of having Dr. Idonia K. Barrett introduce our series. So just a few housekeeping rules before we get into it. Please keep yourself muted. If you have any questions, feel free to just send them to me in the chat. The same goes for the end. At the end, we're going to have a 10-minute Q&A. And if you don't feel comfortable unmuting yourself and asking questions, you can always send it to me or Anna, or, we could ask at the end. So I'm just going to do a little introduction on our speaker. Dr. Barrett is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Hampton University, one of the nation's oldest and highest ranking historically Black universities. Under her leadership, Hampton University has adopted a new strategic focus on diminishing the disparities of injustices that occur within the criminal justice system. Dr. Barrett received her Master of Arts in Criminal Justice with a specialization in criminal law and procedure from John Jay School of Criminal Justice in New York, New York, and she has recently defended her dissertation in the Human Service Program with a concentration in criminal justice at Walden University. Furthermore, Dr. Barrett was nominated for Female Faculty Member of the Year from the HBCU Digest in 2016, and she is also a part of multiple national organizations, including National Association of Blacks in Criminal Justice and the National Organization of Human Services. Lastly, she has recently been accepted into the FBI Citizens Academy Norfolk Field Office for the spring of 2021. So with that said, I'm just going to hand it over to Dr. Barrett and we can get started.
Hello. Thank you so much for that introduction. I sound awesome. Thank you. And thank you so much for asking me to speak and to kick off this speaker series. I am excited to share what little knowledge I have and also to hopefully continue and sparking the dialogue in reference to investing and divesting in matters of policing. So let me, I'm a little shaky in this regard. Let me pull up my PowerPoint. I know we keep hearing this all day long. Can you see? Can you hear me? Are we good in that regards?
All set.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. So as you see on your screen today and this afternoon, I will be speaking in part about the divesting and investing within police budgeting as well as community relations. So let's get into it. I want to kick off first by telling you what to expect, if I can actually click it correctly. There we go. All right, so some discussion points that will be made throughout this presentation, giving an overall sense and part of the brief history of policing in the US, looking at community-oriented policing, providing information that is related to race and ethnicity in reference to crime offenders, arrestees, and police contact, conversation about over-policing in minority communities, of course, budgets, police reform, and looking at the recent developments. So I kind of want to begin more with some feedback from you all, get you involved. So on your screen, again, you'll see I posted some pivotal moments in US history and policing. Of course, this list is not exhaustive, but these were definitely a part of some major turning points in the relations amongst community as well as the policing structure. So if I can get a volunteer or two, just pick at one or more that stands out to you and your knowledge and understanding about what that did in America's history and our relation with policing. I know, it feels like class, right? Don't be scared. I'm here to help. I just want to see what we may know. And I can't see the chat right now. So if my host and co-host can also kind of share what is being said.
I can go first.
Sure.
All of these almost all of these I've recognized. But I think that one that's really at the forefront of my mind right now is the mass incarceration, and how that was systemically used to marginalize and keep people down and out and away. And so I think about that a lot and how it reflects in our system.
Yes, yes, thank you. Also referred to more often by scholars as the new Jim Crow. And of course, the important book out there by Michelle Alexander, who discussed how that transition from post-slavery time and the laws, especially that of the 13th Amendment that went about the changes and further justification, systemic racism and part of mass incarceration. One, perhaps other, I'm hoping not to click on something to see what was said. Any other? One more, I promise. So as we're thinking, I'll say some thinking or typing. I know just this past month, I was speaking with my class, teaching courses in policing, primarily about the Rodney King beating. Now, of course, this is not the first instance, but why it set the tone, or rather changed another part of the mindset, a shift in the mindset of the people, is what this was the first time it was recorded. The feelings towards police brutality, excessive force was known primarily amongst minority communities. And the notion that it was recorded, this brutal beating of this man by several police officers, there was actually some hope amongst the communities that this is it. We have the proof. There is no way that these officers can get away with this. And they did. They were acquitted. Of course, there were many other factors associated. The biggest one, the change in venue, moving the venue of the trial to another part of California in which it was less diverse, just let's put it that way, not limited to, but the jury selection was not of peers and part of who would be sympathetic or the belief of the bias, laying it aside at that time. So picked on that one. Any other ones before we move on? Thought I saw some typing.
I think Mona. Go ahead, Penny.
Like the war on drugs kind of like opened up this whole big door for the crime bill. And like even now how like you have your Black and brown still kind of like getting over processed in jail because of this war on drugs and because of the crime bill.
Yes, thank you so much. The crack epidemic of the 1980s, still feeling the effects. The inclusion of Rockefeller drug laws, even that much more militarized policing tactics used within the communities, and legislation, mandatory minimums, the differences in the weights and the possession. The laws were said to believe to be in part to target the dealer, but it ended up targeting the user. And so again, many other things on your screen that could come up in conversation, but just trying to trigger something within your memory in reference to some, if not all, the major move changes in our nation. But what to this one? Do we recognize some of these names? And two, what do these names signify in reference to the current conversation in our nation? Can you see them? What do they all have in common? Give you an easier one right at the bottom, George Floyd. The question and the conversation about police brutality and excessive force. And so George Floyd's recent death last summer is which really resurged the Black Lives Matters movement. Not a newer conversation, which that began in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin. by George Zimmerman. But a lot of people forget George Zimmerman was not a police officer. He was a wannabe police officer. And so we have to remember that, though there were still the feelings of the injustices experienced on part of the courts because of the stand your ground law. But that's another conversation we could perhaps have at the end. But let's get into, before we get more into the heart, I found it to be important to also talk about community-oriented policing. Now, this concept came about in the 1960s. It's not a new idea. If you look to the key components, as you see there, community partnerships, organizational transformation, and even problem solving. You know, the focus was to, instead of being reactive on part of police, instead of looking to find the bad guy, let's go forth and build relationships with those in the community. And so it's like, okay, this is good. Let's build it so there can be that trust, so we can have that sense of ownership over our communities, rather than having this big brother, big bully, scared of the police mentality. So it's still a concept that is referred to throughout policing in our nation. It's often reverted back to, it continues, there's this ebb and flow of this conversation, but you know, whether or not people are really believing it, of course, that speaks to other concerns. So policing in America, I thought it was interesting to share some stats as it relates to the interactions that we're having amongst policing. Because at one part, when we talk about divesting, which we'll get to, of course, there's this fear of there won't be any monies because there's so much violence that's occurring in our nation. We need to ensure that there is public safety. And so based upon the Bureau of Justice of Statistics' most recent published work, here are some numbers that could probably tell us a little different. So violent crimes, there was a small rise in 2007, but then it continues to decline now. It's still on a downward trend to this day. But looking at who is actually arrested and who is actually committing these violent crimes. So as you see here, Blacks and Hispanics were overrepresented among those arrested. Blacks account only for 13% of the US population, though they had rates of 33% arrests for non-fatal violent crimes and 36% for serious non-fatal. Hispanics, 18% of the US population, arrested at rates of 21%, and then whites were underrepresented. Though they consist of 60% of the US population, they have 46% of non-fatal crimes and 39% of non-fatal crimes excluding assault. So the numbers, if you look at it there, the relationship for Blacks and Hispanics to only be 13 and 18% respectively, they're essentially almost getting arrested at the same rates as that of whites, though there are more. Now, for offenders, again, the breakdown, you can see the numbers are significantly different, yet statistically the same to an extent. But why is this happening? So, oh, hello, how you doing? But let's look beyond the offender, because people don't always come into contact with police because they are criminal or deemed criminals. So why not look at the contacts between police and the public? So this accounts for residents who call and actually have the police come to their residence for whatever reasons, for assistance, for help. This includes traffic stops. This includes, traffic stops, any other contact, or even police initiated contact. So from research, in 2018, within this 12-month period, it was found that 61.5 million US residents aged 16 or older had one or more contact with the police. But it was found, again, Blacks and Hispanics had a higher percentage of contact, regardless of the contact. You see here also 4% of Blacks and 4% of the Hispanics reported being handcuffed in comparison to whites. We also see that when whites are stopped, they themselves have more likely, oh, excuse me, apologies, this is in my way. I'm trying to see what I wrote. We see that whites were more likely than Blacks and Hispanics to have experienced police contact with force as well. And that's missing from there, excuse me for that part. So race is a factor, is it not? But why is it happening? Before we look to the information written out, I want to take your attention to this table here. Americans do recognize that there is systemic issues within policing. Of course, you can see the racial breakdown as well as political affiliation, which we're not going to get into right now. But if we recognize that there is a problem, why aren't we going about changing it? One respect, we find that there is over-policing in minority low-income communities. Residents there state that they experience high crime and they are heavily disadvantaged areas with intensive police presence. Oftentimes, officers are there continuously using excessive force and other forms of aggressive strategies that go forth and further breaks down the trust between the public and the police. Those living in this community too experience high rates of violence, again, heavy police presence, and have limited access to community resources. They also have lack of social capital and a lack of a political voice. Oftentimes not of their bidding, but because of incarceration, we're dealing with the disenfranchisement of people once they have felony convictions. Most states don't allow people to get their rights reinstated. Though some states are coming around, you may have to go through a process or it may automatically be reenacted or reinstated after a period of time. And research conducted by Voigt and his colleagues, 2017 found that officers in their research, they looked at body cam footage and they were able to assess the audio recordings, and from there, controlling for location, controlling for race and age and gender, they found that officers spoke with less respect towards Blacks than that of whites they encountered. So what is going on here? Why is this continuing to happen? And so in one regards, before we get to the whys and the punishment, the over-policing, now we're like, what's going on with the money? So before we get into that, I wanted to show this table here from the Barrett Institute of Justice that shows how much money per resident on average. These are the top 10 cities that are spending the most money per resident. Of course, their overall budgets fluctuate, but we're dealing in part where individuals are spending, or excuse me, the cities are going forth and spending as much as you see in Baltimore, $840 per resident annually. Can anybody speak to some of the, if you have knowledge, of some of the similarities that we notice amongst these top 10 cities?
The crime rate is higher in the cities that spend a lot of money. I used to live in Baltimore City. I have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, and you know, it's getting better for sure. But typically, these cities historically are always on where we see them on the news, right? More often, they're kind of the meter, if will, in reference to police relations and crime rates in America. So, of course, Wilmington, Delaware, kind of in the area, DC, Newark, Bridgeport, Connecticut, New York, who has the largest police department in the nation. A lot of people think it's LAPD, but it's not. And so these numbers, when we speak in terms of divesting and changing, where are these monies going? Or what can they do for us in our community? Okay, so where's the money? Now, contrary to popular belief, policing is second, typically second in most local city budgets. More often, it is a drop in the bucket in comparison to anything else. First, it's education. I know it may not feel that way in some states, but it is education. That's where most monies are spent. And then it comes into terms of public safety. And so giving you some more information here on the screen. Again, New York City, we wouldn't be, or rather you shouldn't be surprised because they are the largest police department and they are covering more cities and with the 5 boroughs in reference, and then behind it, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, and so on and so forth. Now, Minneapolis, of course, has been that much more of a concern in recent year because of that's where George Floyd was killed. And so it was difficult in getting data in this regards from Statista, but the money is there for the purposes of course, paying salaries, supposed academy training, and things of that nature. So let's move into reforming the police. Now, according to the Marshall Project, I came across the many ideas behind it. First things first, I'm sure we've been hearing this one a lot, especially from last summer and this summer, defund the police. Now, that word has gotten a great deal of backlash because of the negative connotations associated with it, the feeling that we're saying, get rid of the police. No, not exactly. But the funding is still an option that is out there amongst activists. So behind that idea, as you see, it is supposed that there's to be a substantial reduction of police department budget and the restructuring of civil life. So a kind of quote that goes along with that idea: fewer police officers, fewer opportunities to brutalize and kill people. Now, the opposition to this is that more police officers lead to fewer use of force complaints. And this is based upon certain research that does find more of a police presence, but there's issues with the methodology and in reference to controlling for one location and monies and resources. Then some may say there is the radical idea of abolishing policing altogether. Get rid of it and replace it. The concerns there is because it's inherently racist. So the viewpoint: replace the police with empowered communities working to solve their own problems. Of course, I shouldn't say of course, but the opposition to that there's going to be a rise in crime and there wouldn't be something in place that will appropriately address the crimes that occur. In other words, there's the fear of chaos thereafter. And the last one that sounds a little bit better to most: reimagining. I know, how different is it from defunding? But semantics, right? So the idea is that you are essentially keeping the monies within the department, but you are shifting it. So instead of focusing on SWAT tactics and other use of force, why not use it for information related to learning about dealing with the mentally ill population, how to respond to those calls, how to respond to persons who are having some kind of breakdown of sorts and not resorting to violence, using other communication tools and so on and so forth, or even building the community relations, having the input of the people, taking the responsibility away. It is believed, and I'm in that boat as well, that police have been utilized for far too many functions beyond that of public safety. So, but there is still opposition, and the idea behind that is that by going this route to reimagining policing, you're still not addressing the racist the racist roots and the persistent role of perpetuating race and class inequities. So looking to the image again on this slide, it came to my mind, came to my attention that the average citizen, American citizen, is really in favor of either keeping funding or increasing funding. And essentially for those reasons, you know, not so much as a fear of policing or, excuse me, a fear of crime, but the mindset is why not keep the monies there to go about the retraining, the reassessing, and the fixing of the department instead of taking away what they may have and possibly dismantling what does exist. So some recent developments. Just this past month, the city of Atlanta has actually gone about approving their 2021 budget, and they've added $1.5 million for the pre-arrest diversion program, which essentially works with the community. Of course, the whole intention is to keep the individual from actually going to jail, put them in treatment programs, especially if they have some form of drug addiction, or if perhaps they're dealing with restitution from bills related to traffic infractions. You know, keeping low offense offenders out of the jail system. They've also gone about approving legislation to create a public safety and community support restricted fund. Now, it wasn't detailed how much money, it wasn't detailed exactly what it's going to look like, but essentially the entire purpose of this public safety and community support is what it says, you know, bringing in the community as well as the inclusion of recreation centers, having community talks, having community leaders to be a part of the conversation so that they can build the trust amongst the police and the public. PG County, which stands for Prince George's County in Maryland, the current executive, one of the current executives asked that they redirect $20 million from the police budget. As of yesterday, when I was looking at their fiscal year budget, they still have not approved the 2021 budget, but in that I did not see any mention of cutting funding, proposing to cutting funding, or even redirecting funding. But a lot of these initiatives or calls for change or supposed calls on part of city council haven't said but so much since really summer of 2020 when a lot of this conversation was sparked about defunding the police because of the George Floyd murder. So Prince George's County is still something to see there. Now, Minneapolis City Council just this week, I mean on Monday, just this Monday, they went about passing a budget to increase the police budget. Now, many of people are up in arms about that because one, that's where George Floyd was killed. And you would think that would be ground zero for the change, especially in a call for defunding. But the arguments as into why they had to go about increasing the budget was for the purposes of hiring new recruits, because many of officers left the force in response to the call for changes, the charges, or the pending indictments among those who are part of George Floyd's death. So their thinking is we need to build up our police force. So we need the monies to bring in the people so we can have a force. Baltimore City Council has gone about eliminating $22 million from their police budget. Now those monies are to be directed to building community centers, mental health treatment opportunities, facilities, and one of the biggest things they said was opening the recreational centers on Sundays, allowing for people to have somewhere to go and being that much more active within the community, as well as job readiness programs. Portland City Council cut $15 million from its budget, and $5 million so far has been diverted to a program intended to have unarmed first responders, especially dealing with the population of the mentally ill that's having an episode instead of the use of force. Los Angeles, they did go about approving and finalizing and reallocating their funds. But from what I saw, only about 10 million has been redirected to community outreach, and that was to a summer program, a youth summer program for job readiness. Everything else has been kind of redirected in the budget, really to save people's jobs, civil servant jobs, dealing with the coronavirus. Some more. Philadelphia, they did go about canceling $19 million increase for their police departments. The push now is to have 14 million go in 3 departments, one in particular, housing. City Council in Hartford, they haven't decided so much yet, but 2 million will be cut or reallocated to what has not been decided. And also this week, I came across information related to the mayors in Raleigh and Durham, North Carolina. Just on Tuesday, a bill was introduced by the Senate to punish cities who seek to reduce the police budget. So if they find any city reducing their police budget by more than 1%, the idea is to cut their funding as well. Again, it's still a bill. It hasn't been approved, but it's on the floor for discussion. And it was introduced in retaliation, essentially, because of this wave of defunding the police, the conversations, the protests, and that nature. And so really they're being preemptive and really pushing back that notion. And lastly here, San Francisco has gone about approving $60 million to be diverted from their budget to other departments, again, including public health. Some other last points, and I'll open it up. In looking at reform and the conversation about divesting and investing, I came across the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020. Now, this did pass in the House on June 25th, which its purpose is to look at all of these elements that we are concerned with. Police relations with the community, really the monies. Now, monies are important, but if you look to any other kind of major city, the budget, the policing budget is very minimal in comparison. So honestly, divesting, or rather defunding, that would go about, I shouldn't say dismantling, but it could bring about other issues. And so instead of really focusing to get rid of monies, it's really important to allocate within that police budget where the efforts should go, instead of going into just use of force, but looking into de-escalating and other training, cultural sensitivity, things of that nature. So within this proposed bill that was drafted by Democrats and spearheaded by members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the act itself, some of the major points is establish a national standard for police operations, mandate data collection. Right now on a national level, we do have the UCR, the Uniform Crime Report, as well as NIBRS, National Incident-Based Reporting Center System, and NCVS, National Crime Victimization Survey. But there are still issues because those things are voluntary. But typically most departments are involved with reporting their data to those agencies for collection, but it's not mandated. So there's this push to make it a mandate. Also, within this act, reprogramming existing funds and streamlining federal law to prosecute excessive force and establish independent prosecutors for police. Furthermore, going into detail of those points, which has been brought to the attention continuously throughout conversations in reference to the restructuring or the divestment, defunding, reimagining, however you want to label it, these here have been of most importance to the people and have been outlined within the Policing Act. End racial and religious profiling. Save lives by banning chokeholds and no-knock warrants. New York has gone about banning the chokehold technique used in policing and actually got a lot of backlash from the police union there. No-knock warrants. Kentucky one has gone about really in response to Breonna Taylor. Limit military equipment on American streets. Body cameras are in existence, of course, but it's not something that's afforded to all agencies and departments at the time. And so the need to provide them with that technology as well as using that technology is important, because unfortunately we are hearing instances of, when was the body camera turned on? Was it cut off? Because right now in most departments, officers do have the ability to turn on and off their said cameras. Also, there's the push to investigate and hold officers accountable for police misconduct. You know, there are systems put in place with internal review. There are some cities that do have the involvement of citizens as a part of the process, but there's concern there that there's not a lot of transparency in that regards. Empower communities. That's, of course, one of, if not should be the top, in reimagining public safety. People have to remember the police, they are civil servants, but they're really there to not just protect us, but they are there for us. And it's unfortunate that still in this day that we have it so that people do not have a trusting relationship. And it's not going to be fixed overnight for sure. So I'm not going to be a wave of the wand. And even if the passage of this said bill is not going to end that all, but at least it will bring about an accountability for many. So pushing forward as well, changing of the culture and other issues that have come about in policing is stopping the sexual assault in law enforcement custody. Okay. So in summary, the move in changing policing in America really deals in part with reimagining, we'll just use that, the word of the day. But in that, you should think about the demilitarization, the dismantling of the code of silence, the blue wall, increase police accountability. A lot of states are going forward to either change or seek to get rid of qualified immunity, which essentially allows not just officers, but primarily government officials, they cannot be sued for things that they've done on the job in good faith. But you know, that's been overused in a lot of people's opinion. So you know, you definitely want to protect persons who are carrying out their job, but we do need to account for the rogue cops, or the bad cops that do exist. Another aspect, not so much involving policing, but policing strategies on the policy level, would be that of decriminalizing low-level offenses. We're seeing a lot of decriminalization, if not legalization, of said street drugs across our nation. Was it just the top of this year? Oregon has actually gone about decriminalizing street drugs, primarily marijuana and I believe crack. But the idea is not to say that, oh, we'll just let them off with a slap on the wrist. They can receive a monetary fine and then they are diverted to treatment programs instead of going to prison. Lastly, eliminate the role of police in situations where alternative interventions are needed. Giving Oregon again, CAHOOTS is a program that's been in existence actually for over 30 years now. And their goal is to be that intervention specialist for anybody having an episode, whether a disorder, a psychotic episode, or that of a drug abuse situation. So, and actually using this program, the police that you see there, they've been able to save $14 million as it speaks to ambulance and emergency hospitalization costs. So there's hope out there. You know, I think we get caught up in the language. Language is important, but I think we get caught up in the hot words such as defunding, divesting, investing are important parts, but we also need to map out what that looks like. And so, oh, good. Just make sure I didn't spend too much time, but thank you all for your time and attention. This is my contact information at Hampton University if anybody wants to reach out to me, and then open the floor for questions.
Feel free to, oh, Anna has a question, sorry.
But I do have a question, because I always have a question. So I guess as a school of public health, what types of things from your perspective can we do to elevate this work and to make sure that we're being advocates, and not, adding to the problems?
Well, that there, being involved in the community, I think the biggest thing, I know that's so easy to say, but I think first getting the voice of the people, because right now they don't feel heard. In my opinion, I think everybody's talking over what they need. Also, getting the information about what they're experiencing, but giving them real life chances, real life opportunities to make those changes. Because again, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. Because in essence, there needs to be a trust within the police and the people. I was fortunate to born and raised in New Rochelle, New York. Very diverse area, different incomes. And, I'm not ignorant to the interactions that people have had, negative interactions with police. I have friends who have experienced excessive force. I myself have been fortunate to not experience that. But again, I'm not ignorant to its existence. And unfortunately, people are in a space where, because it doesn't happen to them, they don't think it exists. So from the public health perspective, when going into these communities, it will be vital to make sure that their voice is heard. Let them be the ones to talk out, to speak out, kind of give them the tools to be the ones to go forth and make those changes. Because yes, you should be there, part of the change, but it brings about not just a pride, but it gives them the opportunity to do this again in other areas, not just in terms of policing. Dealing with housing market, dealing with the job market, dealing with education. And so it's important to not just tell them what to do, but give them the tools and what to do.
Thank you.
No problem. Other questions or comments? Some you learned today. I'll pose a question. Sorry, this is the teacher in me. When you look at the numbers and seeing that really the policing budget is not in comparison to the overall general budget of a local city, is it surprising to see that it's really a drop in the bucket rather than this mass amount of money that we believe is just at expense? Oh, there's a hand. Yes, Anthony.
Hi, so first of all, thank you for your presentation. It was really informative. So to answer your question, it is surprising, I think, to see how, because in my head, at least, I expected the budget to be more, if that makes sense. But also, like, part of the reason I raised my hand is because I had a question or a comment. So one of the things I'm working on is I've actually been trying to write a data brief specifically around police activity in Providence, Rhode Island, and its public health significance. The challenge I've been having is, like, I haven't really gotten, long story short, I've been having a very difficult time actually getting data from any source in the city to actually analyze. So my main driving pith of my narrative was, like, we can't advise, like, because Providence has a community policing board, but I can't really tell what specifically that means in practice. So my argument was, like, well, if you actually make this data available, we could say one way or the other if it's effective or not. My question is, like, is that an effective argument, or, like, do you think there'd be a better way of, like, bringing this attention to government officials? I'm just curious, like, your perspective, because, like, my concern is that, like, that could be weaponized against the effort, and maybe it's like, oh, well, we need more, like, I don't know, like, funding for police body cams or whatever. I don't know. I'm just curious your thoughts. So.
Oh, I understand that, because there's definitely that fear. You're going to use this to go about your agenda, but in actuality, the data should be readily available to you. Now, in its immediacy may vary. Typically, cities will post. I mean, I'm not really specific on which one you would want, but they typically post on their websites the annual data numbers. And what's also a help again, and that's why even within this last justice bill is to mandate the reporting. Because overall, you get a good report. UCR, they do have a high response rate, but again, it's not a requirement. And so, you know, if you can honestly more so come from the perspective of what you want to get, because you know, there are laws out there in which offices, like say that on campus, you know, they have to provide you, because of the Clery Act, they have to provide you with the data related to any crime incidences and such on campus and surrounding. And so there might be some specific data that they would readily have to provide you. But, you know, honestly, tact is important. And, you know, but I would never back down from getting the information, getting the truth, or getting the picture, I will say, to share. And so sometimes you might just have to come from another medium, but definitely getting it from the police would be that much more effective. But oftentimes, like US Census data, you may get some roundabout information from which can help to present to them in some way, but you're definitely going to hit the wall with more with public relations. It's not impossible, but you probably got to work your way by knowing somebody within the force who can get you to that person, who could possibly get you that information.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
No problem. Yes, and Sarah.
Hi. This is an excellent talk. Thank you so much. So this seems like such a odd question for me to ask, but I'm relatively new to working with youth who are in the juvenile justice system. And so because I'm not familiar, I don't really know much about if there is a parallel movement to the one you've been presenting on within the police forces and the organizations that directly work with youth. So I was wondering if you have heard anything about those kinds of activities.
Okay, good question. Actually, there are attempts being made in some departments, some police departments across the nation with this reimagining, simply like taking officers out of the school. You know, when we speak in terms of the school to prison pipeline, and not even just what the students experience in terms of the punishments and expulsion, but on part of the police presence within the schools. So there's actually, Minneapolis has gone about removing police officers from within the school system. And so there has been somewhat of that change within the juvenile justice system that we're still dealing with. And again, goes back and forth, because what the issue is, we haven't been treating them as juveniles anymore. They've been treated as adults. And so, you know, the famous phrase of the 90s, I know some of us may not have been born yet, but super predators. And that notion that, you know, they're evil, they're bad, we got to do whatever it takes to keep them under. And so it allowed for prosecutors or Commonwealth attorneys to skip over the adjudication process of deciding whether or not to try them as adults, but depending upon the crime and age, let's just try them as adults. And so right now, we are in that space where we need to divert juveniles back to juvenile justice. And so that is needed for sure. So that is one way of something to consider, the relationship that they have within the schools, police within the school system, but then primarily overall as a society, we're not treating them as juveniles anymore.
It's so wild to think about it that way, that we actually want to get juveniles back in the juvenile justice system because they shouldn't be there in the first place.
Yeah, because it was created for the purposes of, you know, coming from a rehabilitative approach. You know, the notion that they're kids, they mess up, let's give them a chance instead of just locking them away. I mean, if you look at the language that's even used, they don't say sentencing, they say adjudication. They don't say prison, they say detention. They don't say a court or a trial, they say a disposition hearing, you know, things of that nature. So even the language holds value, but they're no longer juveniles. We're trying them as adults, as young as 16, and I think Pennsylvania is as young as 10 years old. I did a case in grad school, and he did kill somebody. But, you know, at 10 years old, there's no chance of rehabilitation. You know, it's scary that way. So first things first, we have to put them back in the juvenile system or give them the option of juvenile justice rather than throwing them into adult prisons. And even adults, that's not even to say that adults shouldn't get an opportunity for change, because unfortunately rehabilitative programs, that's the first thing that gets cut in correctional budgets, vocational training, and things of that nature. So we as a society are not that forgiving, but we want people to do better.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions or comments, thoughts? So I'll ask a question. So where do we stand? Do we believe in divestment, or do we like that term reimagining? Or we're just like, let's start over. I feel like I'm really in class.
I like the idea of like starting over.
Okay, starting over. So you would kind of abolish the system.
Well, I mean, not abolish it, but there's like this, like even with education, like things are at like at a place of where do you go from here? You know what I mean? Like we're at like this pivotal place of what happens next. Where can we go from here? And sometimes you have to move backwards to move forward. And so with everything that's happening, even with like COVID related stuff, you know, we've been told that things couldn't be a certain way with society. Oh, like we don't have enough computers for the kids. People can't work from home, but now everybody's working from home. You know, and stuff like that. So you can't say like, oh, we can't defund the police or we can't change things in the system when everything has been proven otherwise. So it might not be as like glorious as like starting over, but it could just be, let's go back to the basics. And if the basics aren't clean, as we know they wasn't clean, you know, we know it wasn't clean, let's like figure it out and clean it up. I don't know.
Oh, that is. Any other thoughts or questions or comments?
I had a quick question, if that's okay. First of all, thank you for being here. I really learned a lot. So one thing that just really excited me was learning about like the Oregon Cahoots program. And it was cool how you shared like some evidence that, you know, investing more money in these social supports and supporting people with who are experiencing homelessness or like mental health issues is actually turned out to be cost effective. So I'm just wondering, like, for someone who's interested in learning more about this, like where would be a good place to turn in terms of like finding more evidence to support that these programs really work? And then second, like, what do you think is the best way to like advocate maybe to our state and local governments for investing in these types of programs?
Thank you for that question. I like research. I know that sounds lame, but I've signed up for myself with the federal government databases where I get daily emails. Was it NCIC, Crime Solutions, Bureau of Justice of Statistics. You can easily, as soon as you open the page, they're like, hey, sign up. And you can sign up, and then you can also adjust it so that you will get targeted with specific information. Like mine is typically juvenile, correctional, and policing strategies and reentry programs and their effectiveness. And so those things exist as well. And that's a great opportunity for that. I also get news alerts from the US Census Bureau. You can set that up as well. Of course, it's national data, but you just got to spend time for where you can get city specific and state specific information. And you know, it just takes time, not a lot of time, but it just takes a moment so you can sit there and actually sift through the information. And oftentimes, especially like the US Census, you can get raw data, the raw data and spreadsheets and such, so that you can add it into your own, if you're a statistician, excuse me, SPSS or any other kind of software program, so that you can run the numbers for your own findings. And so, you know, simply put, just a lot of reading, news alerts, and then even going into my own little investigation of these programs that come up, you know, going to their websites. And I haven't done so much as contacting individuals as yet, but getting the scope and getting the structure of what their premise and purpose is. So like even looking into preparation for this and coming across Cahoots, I was like, wow, this has been around for 30 plus years. And it's like, you know, there are things that exist already, but about them being replicated or even being added to, oh, cool, somebody knows. Oh, that's awesome. Cahoots presentation. So it's like, it's very interesting to see that there are things that out there exist. Now, in reference to your second question about how to get, bring this to light to local officials, I think the easiest start would be city council. If you recognize a lot of the budgets and stuff, those meetings, I know it's COVID, a lot of them are virtual now, but their information is readily available on websites. You can start to reach out, share with them your interests, or perhaps even being that much more involved. But I think starting at the local level is always the easiest, just to get your footing and your bearing. Because I think we always love the national level in response for federal response, because you know they set the standard, because once they say it, everybody has to do it. Right now, we're still dealing with the states trickling and cities doing their own thing. And so we're getting this hodgepodge of different strategies. And so, you know, whether or not, kind of referring back to the Justice Act, the George Floyd Justice Act, that would be something if it actually gets passed. Again, the House passed it, but it's sitting, you know, of course, the branches of government, we remember Schoolhouse Rock, we still have to go to the Senate and the president. So, but city council, and sign up for a lot of those sites, data websites. We get a lot of information there.
Thank you.
No problem. Oh, that's so cool. I might jump into that. It was tomorrow, 3 o'clock. Any other questions? Oh, Tracy. And then Sarah.
Hi there. Thanks so much
Hi.
for your presentation. It's been great.
Oh, thank you. No problem.
I am an alum and a current staff person, and I'm very active in Providence with a few groups that are working to reform policing. So for folks who aren't reading the chat, I did put my email address in there. I'm part of a group that met with the mayor over Zoom last night. We are having one of our state senators come to one of our meetings next Tuesday night. I don't know if you've heard of LEABOR, the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, Professor. I think it's a unique burden in Rhode Island, but that's another thing we're trying to either throw out or revise. So thank you for letting me share.
No problem. Thank you. And Sarah, I believe what's the next.
All right, guys. We have 1 minute left, unless anyone has any, I guess, pressing comments or questions that they really want to ask Dr. Barrett, or even just to talk about. But if not, thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. The Graduate Student Council is so happy that everyone showed up, and I'm so thankful for Dr. Barrett for being. I'm so happy. So if you guys have any questions about the research that Dr. Barrett does or anything that she's working on, feel free to reach out to her, or you can always reach out to one of us and we'll give you her contact information also. But thank you guys so much for coming, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care, guys.